Tony Bennett stepped out of the Carlyle Hotel into the crisp October evening, pulling his coat tighter against the Manhattan wind. At 97, he moved carefully, but with the dignity that had defined him for 7 decades in show business. His performance at the hotel's famous Café Carlyle had been intimate and perfect. Just 40 guests, including old friends and long-time supporters who had paid enormous sums to hear him sing one last time in the venue where he had performed hundreds of times over the years. As Tony raised his hand to hail a taxi, a yellow cab immediately pulled up to the curb with an eagerness that seemed almost predestined. The driver, a man in his 60s with greying hair and kind eyes, turned around with a smile that seemed to recognize Tony before Tony had even gotten into the car. "Mr. Bennett," the driver said warmly, "it's an honor to have you in my cab again." Tony settled into the back seat, slightly puzzled by the driver's familiar tone. In his long career, he had been recognized by countless taxi drivers, hotel employees, and service workers. But something about this man's greeting felt more personal than the usual fan recognition. "Thank you," Tony replied politely. 1485, Fifth Avenue, please. And again? "I'm sorry, but I don't remember having ridden with you before." The driver's smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of gentle disappointment. "October 15th, 2003. 20 years ago exactly. Same date, same time, same pickup location. You were leaving the Café Carlyle then too, after what you said was going to be your final performance there. But it wasn't. Was it?" Tony studied the driver's face in the rearview mirror, searching his memory for any recollection of this encounter. The Alzheimer's that had been gradually stealing his memories made it difficult to distinguish between forgotten experiences and imagined ones. But something about the driver's specific details felt authentic. "I'm sorry," Tony said carefully, "but I don't remember that ride. What's your name?" "David Kowalski," the driver replied, pulling into traffic with the smooth confidence of someone who had been navigating Manhattan streets for decades. "And I understand why you wouldn't remember, Mr. Bennett. You were in a very dark place that night. You spent the entire ride talking about how you were finished, how your voice was gone, how you were too old to continue performing." Tony felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. 2003 had indeed been one of the most difficult periods of his career. He had been 77 years old, struggling with health issues, and convinced that his relevance as a performer was fading in a world that seemed to have moved beyond the standards he had spent his life perfecting. "What else did I say?" Tony asked, his curiosity overcoming his discomfort. David's eyes met Tony's in the rearview mirror. "You said you were thinking about ending it all. Not just your career, Mr. Bennett. Everything." The words hit Tony like a physical blow. He had never spoken about those thoughts to anyone. Not to his wife, Susan. Not to his doctors. Not to his closest friends. The idea that he might have shared such intimate despair with a stranger in a taxi seemed impossible. But the specificity of David's recollection was troubling. That's not something I would typically discuss with anyone," Tony said quietly. "You weren't yourself that night," David replied. "You had been drinking, not heavily, but enough to lower your guard. You kept talking about how you had outlived your usefulness, how the world had moved on without you. You said you felt like a ghost haunting your own life." As David spoke, fragments of memory began to surface in Tony's mind. He did remember that period of profound depression, the feeling that he was performing for audiences out of nostalgia rather than genuine appreciation for his artistry. He remembered nights when the applause felt hollow, when he wondered if people were clapping for who he had been rather than who he still was. "What happened during that ride?" Tony asked. "What did you say to me?" David smiled, and Tony could see genuine warmth in his expression. "I told you about my daughter, Maria. She was 16 then, and she had been battling leukemia for 2 years. The doctors had given us very little hope, and my wife and I were spending every moment we could at her bedside in Mount Sinai Hospital. Tony felt his heart constrict. He had always been deeply affected by stories of families facing medical crises, particularly when children were involved. "I told you," David continued, "that during Maria's worst nights when the chemotherapy was making her so sick she couldn't sleep, I would play your music for her. I left my heart in San Francisco. The way you look tonight, Fly Me to the Moon. Your voice was the only thing that could calm her down and help her rest." David paused at a red light and turned around to face Tony directly. "I told you that your music was literally keeping my daughter alive, giving her hope and peace during the most frightening time of her life. I said that if you stopped performing, if you gave up, you wouldn't just be hurting yourself. You'd be taking away something precious from people like Maria, who needed your voice to survive." Tony felt tears beginning to form in his eyes. "What did I say? You asked me to take you to the hospital instead of your apartment. You said you wanted to meet Maria." The memory came flooding back with stunning clarity. Tony remembered that night now, the ride with David, the conversation about his daughter, the decision to visit a sick child instead of going home to his depression and despair. He remembered walking into Maria's hospital room and seeing a pale, thin teenager whose eyes had lit up when she saw him. "We spent 2 hours in that room," Tony said quietly, the memories now flowing freely. "I sang for her, quietly, so we wouldn't disturb the other patients. She knew every word to every song." "She died 3 weeks later," David said softly. "But those 2 hours with you were the happiest she had been in months. She talked about that night constantly in her final weeks. She said that meeting you proved that there were still angels in the world." Tony was crying openly now, overwhelmed by the memory of Maria's courage and by the realization of how that chance encounter had changed the trajectory of his life. "After Maria died," David continued, "I kept driving this taxi, and I kept thinking about what you had told her that night. You said that music doesn't belong to the person who creates it. It belongs to the people who need it. You said that as long as there was one person in the world who found comfort in your songs, you had a responsibility to keep singing. That's why I never retired," Tony realized. "That night changed everything for me. Maria saved your life, Mr. Bennett, just like your music saved hers. When I picked you up at the Carlyle 20 years ago, you were ready to give up. When I dropped you off at the hospital, you had remembered why you started singing in the first place." David pulled up in front of Tony's Fifth Avenue apartment building, but neither man made any move to end the ride. "David," Tony said, "why didn't you ever tell me who you were? In all these years, why didn't you ever reach out?" "I didn't need to," David replied. "I've been watching your career for the past 20 years, Mr. Bennett. I've seen you perform with Lady Gaga, watched you win Grammy after Grammy, seen you inspire a whole new generation of musicians. Every time I saw you on television or read about you in the papers, I knew that Maria's message had gotten through to you." "But there's more, isn't there?" Tony asked, sensing that David's story wasn't finished. "Something you haven't told me yet." David nodded, his expression becoming more serious. "My grandson, Michael, is 16 now, the same age Maria was when she died. He's been battling the same form of leukemia that took his aunt." Tony felt his heart stop. "David, why didn't you tell me this earlier?" "Because I didn't want you to feel obligated, Mr. Bennett. I didn't want you to visit Michael out of guilt or pity. But when I saw you coming out of the Carlyle tonight, on the exact anniversary of the night you met Maria, I thought maybe it was meant to be." Tony was already reaching for his phone. "Where is Michael now?" "Mount Sinai, same hospital where you met Maria. He's been there for 3 weeks, and the doctors say the next few days are critical." Take me there, Tony said without hesitation. Right now. As David pulled back into traffic, Tony reflected on the strange circularity of his life. 20 years ago, a taxi driver's story about his dying daughter had saved Tony from despair and inspired him to continue his career. Now, that same taxi driver was giving Tony the opportunity to repay that debt by bringing comfort to another child facing the same battle. David, Tony said as they drove toward the hospital, you said that your daughter's death taught you something about music. What was it? I learned that music is medicine, Mr. Bennett. It doesn't cure disease, but it cures despair. It doesn't save lives, but it makes life worth living. Maria taught me that every song you sing is a prescription for hope, and that every performance you give is an act of healing. When they arrived at Mount Sinai, David led Tony through familiar corridors to the pediatric oncology ward. In room 347, they found Michael Kowalski, a thin, pale teenager who looked remarkably like his aunt had 20 years earlier. But when he saw Tony Bennett walking into his room, his eyes lit up with the same wonder and joy that Maria's had shown. "Are you really Tony Bennett?" Michael whispered, his voice weak from chemotherapy but filled with disbelief. "I am," Tony said, sitting down in the chair beside Michael's bed. "And I hear you're a fan of music." "My grandfather plays your songs for me every night," Michael said. "He says they helped my Aunt Maria when she was sick, and they helped me too." Tony spent the next 3 hours in Michael's room, singing quietly, telling stories about his career, and listening to Michael talk about his dreams of becoming a musician himself. As the evening progressed, other patients and their families began gathering in the doorway. Drawn by the sound of Tony's voice and the obvious joy it was bringing to everyone who heard it. When Tony finally prepared to leave, Michael grabbed his hand with surprising strength. "Mr. Bennett," the teenager said, "my grandfather told me about the night you met my aunt. He said you were thinking about quitting music, but she convinced you to keep going. Is that true?" "It's true," Tony replied. "Your aunt saved my career that night." "Well," Michael said with a smile that reminded Tony powerfully of Maria, "I want you to know that your music is saving my life now. Every song you sing gives me strength to fight for one more day." As Tony and David rode back through the Manhattan night, both men were quiet, processing the emotional weight of the evening. "David," Tony finally said, "I need to ask you something. How many times have you driven me in this taxi over the past 20 years? David smiled in the rearview mirror. "This is only the second time, Mr. Bennett, but I've been hoping for 20 years that I would get the chance to tell you what your music has meant to my family." "And you waited until tonight, on the anniversary of our first meeting?" "I drive this route every night, Mr. Bennett. Past the Carlyle, past your apartment building, past the hospital. I've been hoping that someday I would see you on the street and get the chance to thank you properly for what you gave Maria. When I saw you tonight, at exactly the same time and place where I picked you up 20 years ago, I knew it wasn't a coincidence." Tony reflected on the mysterious ways that life connects people across time and circumstance. "David, what you've given me tonight is more valuable than any Grammy or any review or any standing ovation. You've reminded me why I do what I do. And what you've given Michael tonight will carry him through whatever comes next, just like it carried Maria." As they pulled up in front of Tony's apartment building for the second time that night, Tony made a decision that would shape the final years of his career. "David, I want to establish a music therapy program at Mount Sinai in Maria's honor, and I want you to help me design it." "Mr. Bennett, I'm just a taxi driver." "No," Tony said firmly. "You're a man who understands the healing power of music better than anyone I've ever met. You're someone who knows how to connect artists with the people who need them most. Over the following months, Tony and David worked together to create the Maria Kowalski Music Therapy Program, which brought live musical performances to pediatric patients throughout New York's hospital system. The program became a model that was eventually adopted by hospitals around the world, bringing comfort to thousands of sick children and their families. Michael Kowalski recovered from his leukemia and went on to become a successful musician himself, often performing in the program that had been inspired by his aunt's memory and his grandfather's faith in the healing power of music. Tony Bennett continued performing until his death in 2023, but he often said that his most important performance had been the impromptu concert he gave in Michael's hospital room. A reminder that the greatest audiences are often the smallest ones, and that the most meaningful applause comes from people who need music, not as entertainment, but as medicine for their souls. David Kowalski continued driving his taxi until he was 70 years old, but he never forgot the lesson his daughter had taught him, that sometimes the most important conversations happen not in concert halls or recording studios, but in the back seat of a taxi, driven by someone who believes in the power of music to transform despair into hope. The taxi ride that had begun 20 years earlier with a broken man contemplating the end of his career had become a journey that touched thousands of lives and proved that every song has the potential to save someone who desperately needs to hear it. Tony Bennett had learned that night that his music belonged not to him, but to people like Maria and Michael, people who needed his voice not for entertainment, but for survival. And sometimes that's exactly what music is meant to be. Not just art, but medicine. Not just performance, but healing. Not just a song, but a lifeline thrown to someone drowning in darkness, sung by someone who has found the courage to keep singing until the very last note. But there was something David hadn't told Tony about that night 20 years ago. Something he had carried as a secret burden that had shaped every day of his life since Maria's death. 3 days after Tony's visit to the hospital in 2003, when Maria was in her final hours, she had made a confession to her father that had haunted David ever since. "Daddy," Maria had whispered, her voice barely audible above the beeping machines. "I need to tell you something about Mr. Bennett's visit. Something I've been afraid to say." David had leaned closer to his daughter's bed, treasuring what he knew might be among her final words. "When he was singing to me," Maria continued, "I could see that he was crying, not just because of my sickness, but because of something else, something deep inside him that was broken. I think meeting me helped him, but not in the way you think." "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "He told me something while you were getting coffee. He said that when he was young, he had a daughter who got sick, just like me. She died when she was only 6 years old, and he never got to sing for her because he was away on tour when it happened." David's world had tilted that night. Tony Bennett had never publicly spoken about losing a child. And Maria's revelation suggested a private tragedy that explained the profound connection Tony had felt with their family. He said that singing for me felt like getting a second chance to say goodbye to his daughter. He said my name was close to hers. Her name was Marina. For 20 years, David had carried this knowledge without knowing what to do with it. Tony's lost daughter had never appeared in any biography or interview. It was a secret too personal and painful for David to share without permission, yet too important to ignore completely. Now, as David drove through the empty Manhattan streets after their visit with Michael, he realized that the 20th anniversary of that first encounter might be the right time to complete the story that had begun 2 decades earlier. "Mr. Bennett," David said carefully, "there's something else Maria told me before she died. Something about you that I've never shared with anyone." Tony, who had been watching the city lights blur past his window, turned his attention to David with sudden intensity. "She said you told her about your daughter, Marina." The silence in the taxi was deafening. Tony's face went completely still, and for a moment, David worried that he had crossed an unforgivable line. "How could Maria have known that name?" Tony asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "She said you told her, sir. She said you explained that singing for her felt like getting to say goodbye to your daughter, something you never had the chance to do." Tony closed his eyes and David could see tears forming beneath his lids. "I haven't spoken that name aloud in 40 years. Marina died in 1963, when she was 6 years old. I was on tour in California when she got pneumonia. By the time I flew home, she was gone. Maria said you blamed yourself for not being there." "I did more than blame myself," Tony said, opening his eyes and staring directly at David in the rearview mirror. "I stopped believing in God. I stopped believing that my music mattered. I spent the next 15 years drowning my grief in alcohol and self-destruction. It nearly destroyed my career and my marriage." David pulled the taxi over to the curb, recognizing that this conversation required his full attention, rather than the distraction of driving. "Mr. Bennett, Maria wanted me to tell you something, but she made me promise to wait until I thought you were ready to hear it." "What did she want you to tell me?" "She said that during those 2 hours you spent with her, she felt like she had a grandfather. Her own grandfather had died when she was small, and she had always missed having that relationship. But when you sang to her, when you listened to her talk about her dreams and fears, she felt like she was getting to experience what it would have been like to have a grandfather who loved her unconditionally." David paused, seeing the impact his words were having on Tony. "She said that if your daughter Marina was watching from heaven, she would be proud that her father had found a way to give other children the love he never got to give her." Tony was crying openly now, decades of grief and guilt pouring out in the back seat of David's taxi. "There's more," David continued gently. "Maria asked me to give you a message, but only when I felt the time was right. She said, 'Tell Mr. Bennett that Marina forgives him for not being there when she died, and that she's been listening to him sing every night since then, waiting for him to forgive himself.'" Tony buried his face in his hands, overwhelmed by the power of a message that had traveled from one dying child to another, carrying forgiveness across 4 decades of self-recrimination. "How is that possible?" Tony asked. "How could a 16-year-old girl understand something that I've been unable to figure out for 40 years? "Because children see things more clearly than adults," David replied. "Maria understood that love doesn't end with death, and that redemption comes not from avoiding pain, but from transforming it into something that helps other people." David reached into his glove compartment and pulled out a small, worn envelope. "Maria wrote you a letter before she died, but she made me promise not to give it to you until tonight, on the 20th anniversary of your meeting." With shaking hands, Tony opened the envelope and unfolded a piece of hospital stationery covered with a teenager's careful handwriting. "Dear Mr. Bennett," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means my daddy finally told you about Marina and gave you this letter like I asked him to. I know you're probably sad about your daughter, and I know you probably blame yourself for not being there when she got sick. But I need you to know something important. When you sang to me that night, I felt like I had a daddy and a grandpa all at the same time. You gave me something that I needed more than medicine. You gave me hope and love, and the feeling that I mattered to someone famous and important. If Marina was anything like me, she would want you to keep giving that gift to other kids who need it. My daddy told me that you were thinking about stopping your music when you met me. Please don't stop. There are so many kids in hospitals who need to hear your voice. Every time you sing, Marina gets to sing with you. Every time you make someone smile, Marina is smiling too. I won't live long enough to grow up and have kids of my own, but I hope that the kids you sing for will remember your music and sing it for their kids someday. That's how love stays alive forever, by being passed from one person to another, like a song that never ends. Thank you for being my friend for 2 hours. Thank you for showing me that famous people can also be kind people. And thank you for letting Marina's daddy take care of other kids who need music in their lives. Your friend always, Maria Kowalski. P.S. I asked my daddy to become a taxi driver so he could meet people who need help, just like you did that night. He doesn't know I'm the one who suggested it, but I think helping people is the best way to honor someone you love. Tony read the letter twice, then carefully folded it and placed it back in the envelope. David, he said quietly, Maria was the one who inspired you to become a taxi driver. She never said it directly, David replied, but after she died, I found a note in her room suggesting that I find a job where I could rescue people who were lost, like Mr. Bennett was lost that night. I had been working in construction, but something about her note made me think that driving a taxi might give me the chance to help people the way you helped her. How many people have you helped over the past 20 years? David smiled. Hundreds, maybe thousands. I've driven people to hospitals, to funerals, to job interviews, to first dates. I've listened to confessions, given advice, provided tissues for tears, and congratulations for celebrations. Maria was right. Being a taxi driver is like being a priest or a therapist, except you're moving while you're helping people figure out their lives. Tony understood now why their meeting tonight had felt predestined. David hadn't just been driving randomly through Manhattan, he had been following a path that Maria had set for him 20 years ago, a path that was always meant to intersect with Tony's life again. David, I want to do something for you in Maria's honor. Mr. Bennett, you don't owe me anything. You've already done more for my family than I could ever repay. I want to record a song for Maria. Something that she loved, something that will preserve her memory and her message. I want other families going through what you went through to know that they're not alone. What song did you have in mind? Tony thought for a moment, then smiled through his tears. The Way You Look Tonight. It was Maria's favorite, according to her letter, but I want to record it as a duet. With who? With Michael. When he's recovered enough to sing, I want him to sing it with me. One generation passing the song to the next, just like Maria wrote in her letter. 6 months later, Tony Bennett and 16-year-old Michael Kowalski recorded The Way You Look Tonight at Abbey Road Studios in London. The recording became Tony's final studio album, titled Songs for Marina, with all proceeds going to pediatric music therapy programs around the world. Michael's voice, young and clear but seasoned by his battle with cancer, blended perfectly with Tony's aged but still powerful vocals. The song became a testament to the healing power of music and the way that love transcends death and continues to create beauty in the world. David Kowalski retired from taxi driving on the day the album was released. He spent his remaining years working with the Maria Kowalski Music Therapy Program, connecting musicians with sick children and proving that sometimes the most important journeys happen not on roads, but in hospital rooms where songs become medicine and music becomes the language through which love is transmitted from one broken heart to another. The taxi ride that had begun with a desperate man contemplating the end of his career had become a 20-year journey of healing, redemption, and the discovery that sometimes the most important passengers we pick up are the ones who teach us where we're supposed to be going.